to handle the submission of that form, right? Right now, the page doesn't do a darn thing. It just looks like something. So when something happens, we want to do another thing. Let's not worry about what it is we're doing yet. Let's just make it do something. So let's hook up some functionality here. I'm going to flip over to my JavaScript. By the way, if you are using Atom or Code or Sublime Text or any of another number of others, there's a feature called Fuzzy Finder that's really super nice, especially when we get into React and we have lots of files inside a single project. Oh boy, things are going to get even more complicated. Aren't you excited? Hit Command P or Control P on Windows and just start typing any part of the file name. So I'm just going to type JS. Only one JavaScript file in there, and that's going to take me straight to my JavaScript file. Easier than taking my fingers off the keyboard and trying to hunt it down in this little tiny thing over here. By the way, you'll notice I hide and show that a lot. That's because I have limited space up here on the screen. But there's a shortcut for that too. Command B or Control B hides and shows the sidebar. All right, so this time around, we're going to make the whole thing an object from the get-go. And it's going to be a little easier than adding it after the fact. So I'm going to make a constant. We could call it app or something. We could call it Jeffervescence. That's kind of a lot to type. So we'll just call it app for right now. So app is going to be this object here. And we know we're going to have to do something right when the page loads, right? We're going to have to add the event listener at the very least. Not going to do anything besides start listening, but we got to start listening or nothing will happen when the event fires. So let's add a method called init. And then let's just remember, before we go any further, to call it. So app.init at the bottom. And earlier I said there's a shorthand in ES6 for methods. Instead of saying init :function, I can just say init parens like that. So we're going to do that this time. Same thing. It's still just a method called init. Then let's start listening for the event to happen. To happen to what? Our form. Our form had an ID of flick form. And again, we're going to try to make this thing flexible so that this app object would work with forms that have different IDs or that are identified by some other selector entirely. So we're going to make the selector an argument here. Then we're going to say document.querySelector, whatever that selector happens to be. And we'll pass in flick form with the hash down here when we call init. Once we have the form, we want to add an event listener to it, right? Here's another trick for making things readable when you're going to change something. We could save the form to a variable and then call addEventListener on that variable. We're never going to use this variable again, so we could also just chain it to the end of this, right? We could say addEventListener here. But now this line's getting really long and it's hard to read. So you can actually put a line break right before the dot, and JavaScript will figure out what's going on. So I'm just going to put a line break here and indent this, like this. That's still pretty darn easy to read. You can see you're grabbing the form from the DOM and then adding an event listener to it. So addEventListener takes two arguments. The what event you're listening for, and what you want to do when that event occurs. addEventListener is just saying, when something happens, do this other thing. What's the event we're listening for? Submit. And on that page that we linked from the website, there is a non-comprehensive list of events. You can find all of them if you go to MDN, but it's a lot. But it's things like click, mouse move, double click, DOM content loaded, load, very similar to the DOM fully loading, key down, key up, scroll, stuff like that. Submit is the one we're listening for, and then we have to tell it what to do when that happens. Now, we don't have the function that does this yet, right? We could put the function right here inside the parens, or we could name it. We're going to name it. So what do we want to do when the form is submitted? We want to add this flick to a list, right? So I'm just going to name this addFlick. So after init, I'm going to add another method called addFlick. I'm going to use our new shorthand. Don't forget your comma here. And I went ahead and put my comma here too. And then I can just say this dot addFlick, no parentheses. To make sure that that much works, before I go any further, submitted. Just put a console log inside addFlick to make sure that it's wired up correctly so far. Just keep checking along the way so we don't write 50 lines of code before we ever bother to find out whether anything works. Let's check it out. Let's type something in here. Cuss. What's the problem? Prevent default. So remember, an event is going to get passed in here as an argument whether we tell it to or not, because we're not the ones calling addFlick, it's doing it for us. So the very first thing we're going to do in addFlick is prevent default. So if I'd forgotten to do that and I'd written everything else I wanted to have in there and it didn't work, I would think my problem is somewhere else. So I'm trying to test it early and often so I can catch these things before there's too much stuff, because there's no error message accompanying that, right? It just misbehaves. Refresh the page, try that again. Check out our console, submitted. All right, our event listener's there. If we want to make sure we can get the value out of the form, what can we do? We could say const flick name. How do we get the form? We haven't saved it to a variable this time. So we couldn't cheat if we wanted to. We're going to have to get it out of the event with event.target, right? Given the form, how do we get this text box? We use its name. Its name was flick name. That gets us the actual input, not what was typed in it. What was typed in it is its value. So let's console log that instead. Refresh. If you don't know how to add it to a list, make sure you can at least get the thing out of the form in the first place. Yay. It console logged the name of the flick. Yes, indeed.
I have an error that says cannot read property, addEventListener of null.
Okay. Cannot get property addEventListener of null. So what's null? This, right? The result of query selector was null. So your selector's not right. So where did this come from? It's an argument that was passed to init, right? So you need to make sure that when you call init at the bottom, whatever string you put here actually works. Make sure that this ID matches what's in your HTML. I have form ID equals flick form. Do you have the ID on yours? It's the same ID? All right, I'll be with you in just a second. Let me go ahead and commit mine. Okay, so I'm console logging the flick name, so I've got things wired up a little bit. That to me is, even though I'm not really doing anything with it yet, that's a new step. It does work, so I'm going to commit. If yours doesn't work, don't commit yet. Cool. Set up. Submit handler for flick form. If you ever forget how to do just that part, it's right there in that commit. Anybody still have that problem? Okay. You have a look. Thanks. So now let's make it do a little something after I submit. Again, I'm not yet going to worry about adding a new thing to the DOM. I'm going to create a new object to represent this flick. So instead of console logging it, let's do this. I'm going to save the form itself to a variable to save myself some typing. So constaff equals event target. Then I'm going to create a variable flick containing all the data for this flick. They've only got names right now, but maybe they'll have more later. I'm going to say name colon f dot flick name dot value comma. Just to make sure that much is right, I will go ahead and put in a console log flick dot name, right? Flick dot name is how I would get to that. Does that work? Refresh. Yes, it still does it. How about we keep track of a numerical ID for each flick? Like an auto-incrementing integer. Sound fun? Let's do it. So ID colon and then some number. So we need to keep track of the highest number that we've already got, right? So how about when we first run init, in addition to setting up our event listener, what if we set a property on the object to keep track of the highest ID? How would I add a property to this object from inside one of its methods? What? Yeah, how about this dot, whatever I want the property to be called? So how about when the page first loads, we say this dot max equals 0. So when we first run this, we'll call this dot max equals 0, and it will be just as though we had said max colon 0. Kind of like that. This dot max equals 0. And then we can set ID to this dot max plus 1, comma. And then just make sure that sooner or later, at the end of all this, we increment it using plus plus. You guys know plus plus from other languages? So say this dot max plus plus or plus plus this dot max. But you can do it this way. Same, accomplishes the same thing. Under some circumstances, like if it's a return value or something like that, they would be slightly different. max plus plus, plus plus max. Both are going to increment the thing. So if we want to test that, let's just in our console log, let's just put a second argument, this.max. Refresh. ID 4. Undefined. Oh, poopers. We got that and this. And not this.max, flick.max. Flick.id. That's what I meant. Okay. ID 4. ID 4 and not a number. Well, poopers. What's the problem? Louder, Naomi. Loud and proud. This isn't what we think it is. What is it? What is it? We're inside addFlick, and addFlick was called how? It's an event listener, right? I mean, it's an event handler. The event listener is the thing that listens for the event. The event handler is the thing that runs. So we would have to bind this. So let's do it. This.addFlick, bind this. Refresh the page. ID 4. ID 4, 1. JP2. 2. Deathwish, his first roll. 3. It's working. It's keeping track of the ID. Cool. So let's just create a flick object with a name and ID.